I remember the exact moment I realized something wasn't right. Everyone on TV was celebrating, calling it a ceasefire, calling it peace, but the more I looked into it, the more it felt like the opposite. Because what if I told you this isn't the end of a war? What if this is actually the quiet beginning of something much bigger, something most people won't see coming until it's too late? I started digging deeper, trying to understand how we even got here. And what I found surprised me. This situation didn't just appear overnight. It's been building for years, slowly, quietly, like pressure inside a sealed container. I went back to a turning point, a nuclear agreement that once kept things under control. When that deal collapsed, everything changed. Trust disappeared, communication broke down, and from that moment on, it felt like both sides were just circling each other, not attacking directly, not stepping back either, just waiting, like two fighters in a ring, both knowing the first punch could start something they can't stop. Over time, tensions kept rising, talks happened, then failed, promises were made, then broken, and then everything escalated. A short but intense conflict broke out, fast, aggressive, and shocking. Airstrikes, retaliation, global headlines, and then suddenly, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. A ceasefire, and once again the world relaxed. People thought it was over, but sitting there, watching it unfold, I couldn't shake one thought. We've seen this before, and last time it didn't actually end anything. I remember thinking, if history was repeating itself, then something bigger had to be coming next, and I was right. Because just when things seemed calm again, everything exploded in a way no one expected. It didn't start with missiles, it started inside the country itself. Mass protests began to grow, bigger than anything seen in decades, streets filled with people demanding change. At first, it looked like internal unrest, something that might stay contained, but then it turned violent. Security forces cracked down hard. The kind of crackdown that doesn't just silence people, it shocks the entire world. Within days, the situation spiraled out of control, and suddenly, this wasn't just a domestic issue anymore. It became international. That's when I noticed something even more concerning. While the world was focused on the protests, something else was happening quietly in the background. Military movement, troops, equipment, positioning, all increasing at a scale we hadn't seen in years. It felt calculated, deliberate, like decisions had already been made long before the public had any idea. Then came the talks. Diplomatic meetings, back-channel negotiations, statements about progress. On the surface it looked like things might cool down. But the deeper I looked, the more it felt like a delay, not a solution. And then one morning everything changed. Without warning, a massive wave of airstrikes was launched. Not small, not symbolic, overwhelming. Hundreds of strikes within hours. It was the kind of operation that doesn't just send a message. It redraws the entire situation. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. This wasn't a reaction. This was planned. I remember staring at the updates, trying to process what I was seeing, because it kept getting worse. Those airstrikes weren't just targeting facilities. They were targeting people, high-level figures, decision makers, the kind of individuals whose removal doesn't just weaken a system, it destabilizes an entire nation. And then came the moment that changed everything. A strike hit deep inside a secured compound, and within minutes, reports started spreading that one of the most powerful leaders in the region was gone. Not just him, but members of his family too. At first, I thought it might be misinformation. In moments like this, rumors spread fast, but then confirmations started coming in, one by one. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just another military operation. This was a decapitation strike. The kind of move that doesn't just escalate a conflict, it guarantees one. Within hours, more names surfaced. Senior commanders, intelligence officials, key figures who had been running the country's defense and strategy, gone. It felt like the entire leadership structure had been shaken in a single day. But what really stayed with me wasn't just the high-profile targets. It was everything else happening at the same time. Because while precision strikes were being reported, there were also stories of places you wouldn't expect getting hit. Civilian areas, buildings near military zones, even reports of a school caught in the chaos. And suddenly the narrative split. One side calling it collateral damage, the other calling it intentional. And in the middle of all that confusion, one thing became very clear to me. There was no going back. Because just hours later, retaliation began. Drones and missiles launched across borders, heading toward multiple countries, multiple targets. This wasn't contained anymore. This was spreading. And when the first casualties were confirmed on the other side, I realized something that changed how I saw everything. The war hadn't just started, it had locked itself in. That's when I stopped looking at it as just another distant war, because suddenly it wasn't distant anymore. While missiles were flying and headlines were focused on retaliation, there was one move happening quietly in the background that most people completely missed, and in my opinion, it was the most dangerous move of all. A narrow stretch of water, not very wide, easy to overlook on a map, but it carries a massive portion of the world's oil supply every single day. And then it was shut down. I remember thinking, if that stays closed, this doesn't stay a regional conflict, this becomes global. And almost instantly, the effects started showing up in places far away from the battlefield. Fuel prices began rising, fast, not gradually but sharply. Within weeks the cost of energy surged, and it wasn't just about gas. Everything tied to it started shifting: transportation, food, manufacturing. It all started getting more expensive, and that's when it really hit me. You don't have to live anywhere near the conflict to feel it. It shows up in your daily life, quietly draining your wallet, changing your routines, forcing decisions you didn't expect to make. But the situation didn't stop there. Because while the world was dealing with rising costs and uncertainty, something else was happening inside the country at the center of it all. A new leader stepped in, and from everything I could see, this wasn't someone looking to calm things down. This was someone more aggressive, more determined. Someone who didn't signal de-escalation, but continuation. And one of the first signals sent to the world was clear. That critical waterway, it was staying closed, at least for now. And that's when I realized something even more unsettling. This conflict wasn't just about weapons anymore. It was about leverage. Global leverage. And everyone was now part of it, whether they realized it or not. At this point, I thought things had already reached their peak, but I was wrong. Because what came next wasn't just escalation. It was overload. Missile, drones, continuous strikes, not in dozens, but in thousands. The pace didn't slow down. If anything, it intensified. Every day brought new numbers, new damage, new uncertainty. And the impact wasn't limited to one country anymore. It started spreading across the region. Critical infrastructure began taking hits. Energy facilities, supply systems, the kind of targets that don't just affect one nation. They disrupt entire markets. I remember seeing reports about major gas production being severely damaged, not temporarily, but in a way that could take years to recover. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't just a military conflict anymore. This was economic disruption on a global scale. Countries that once felt stable suddenly didn't. Places known for business, for security, for wealth, they started looking vulnerable. Investors pulled back, confidence dropped, and uncertainty took over. But what really caught my attention was the tone of the messages coming from leadership. They weren't calming things down, they were getting more intense. Warnings, threats, statements that sounded less like strategy and more like preparation for something even bigger. And then one message stood out, a message that didn't just talk about targets or operations, it talked about destruction on a scale that felt almost unimaginable. When I read it, I paused, because it didn't sound like negotiation. It sounded like a line being drawn. And right around that same time, something unexpected happened. Behind the scenes, efforts to stop everything suddenly accelerated. Diplomacy kicked in, multiple countries got involved. Pressure started building from every direction. It was like the world collectively realized, if this continues, it might go too far. And just when it felt like everything was about to cross that line, a deal was announced. A ceasefire. 2 weeks. That was the window. 2 weeks to stop the escalation or risk something much worse. And I remember thinking, this isn't peace, this is a countdown. When the ceasefire was announced, the world finally exhaled. Markets reacted instantly. Prices dropped. Headlines shifted. It looked like everything was stabilizing, but I didn't feel relieved, because something about it felt rushed. Like a pause button had been hit in the middle of chaos, not to end it, but to control it. And then, almost immediately, cracks started to show. The agreement wasn't as complete as it sounded. Certain areas weren't included. Certain groups weren't part of the deal. And within hours, strikes were happening again. Different location. Same conflict. That's when it really sank in for me. This wasn't a full stop. It was a partial pause. And those are the most dangerous kind, because they create the illusion that everything is under control when it's not. Tension started building again, fast. Warnings were issued, threats returned, and behind all of it, one major issue remained completely unresolved. The core reason this conflict started in the first place still wasn't solved. No clear agreement, no confirmed dismantling, no real trust between sides. Just silence and uncertainty. And then I came across something that changed how I saw the entire situation. Massive funding being prepared. Long-term planning. Not for weeks, but for something much bigger. That's when it hit me. What if this ceasefire isn't meant to end the conflict? What if it's meant to prepare for the next phase? Because when you look at everything together, the rising tensions, the unstable agreements, the unresolved issues, the ongoing strikes in nearby regions, it doesn't look like a conclusion. It looks like a setup. And the scariest part, most people still think it's over. But from where I'm standing, it feels like we're just in the quiet space between two storms. And if that's true, then the real question isn't whether this holds. The real question is, what happens when it doesn't?